So, Bill, let's just start with there's two different dynamics that are happening here in terms of the safety of the Boeing 737 MAX. There is the story of, and this is basically like many sort of product safety stories. This is a story of choices. And this is a story of incentives that inform those choices. So let's start with the incentives, and then we will talk about the choices that were made. The incentives that you talk about in your piece about that Boeing face is something that you and I have talked about in the past. And that is, and so I want to keep this general, and then we can get closer to Boeing. But that is that in the early 80s, there was a series of changes having to do with our tax code and what monies was sort of taxed at a more favorable rate than other monies, and also a decision by the SEC as to changing the law, essentially, that at one point what used to be criminal stock manipulation was now just simply a strategy to theoretically give back to shareholders. Just tell us about those two dynamics so that we know the general climate in which created these incentives for Boeing executives.
Yeah, so in 1982, under what is known as Rule 10b-18, the SEC basically gave companies what we call a license to loot. They could just pump all this money out of their companies, not just in the form of dividends, which done in moderation and consistent with company investing in the future, paying its workers, etc., are legitimate, but stock buybacks, which are done as open market repurchases, I would argue are illegitimate. And although they were never illegal prior to 1982, on the scale that they're being done, anywhere near the scale they're being done now, the SEC could have charged all these companies with manipulation of the stock price. And that's what they're doing with open market repurchases. So that's been going on a large scale since the mid-1980s. And companies more and more embraced that practice as part of an ideology that started getting widely articulated in the mid-1980s and was related to these changes at the SEC, which was basically let the money flow through financial markets, and it'll end up somewhere where you'll be getting some productivity out of it. The notion that you maximize shareholder value. That legitimized basically this practice of just pumping out money to shareholders. And by the way, it's not giving anything back to the shareholders, because the shareholders don't give the company anything; they just buy and sell shares. So, Apple, which has done $273 billion of buybacks since 2013, they call it their capital return program, but they're not returning anything to anybody who ever gave them anything. They're just giving money to people who buy and sell shares. In this case, it's just selling shares. So that's the basic context. And related to that, there was a increasing use of stock-based pay for executives in the form of stock options and stock awards that gave executives higher pay when the stock price went up and they cashed in their options or awards. And that was really totally behind the explosion of CEO pay and top executive pay more generally that we see from the 1980s. There's a lot of people who write on this who think that it started when Bill Clinton had a silly proposal to tax executive pay over salaries over $1 million, and that led them to use more stock options and stock awards. But that's not correct. It really started in the 1980s as basically the whole world was shifting to this crazy notion that companies should be run to maximize the value of the people who matter least, that is the shareholders, and then forgot about the workers and forgot about us as taxpayers who help support these companies.
So, Bill, so let me just, if I could, so we basically have a two-step dance here. One is we adopt this sort of ideological perspective, which is shareholder value is why companies exist, for shareholder value. This is something now that I think we just accept as, in the same way that we do gravity, but that's not necessarily, that's just simply a political choice that we make. And then the second step is we make the top executives of the corporation, and maybe the board of directors on some level too, we make them some of the shareholders who also control the levers. So when we talk about shareholder value, we have basically created, it seems, in our corporations, almost a cottage industry, right? That doesn't necessarily rely on what the company does, but rather relies on what the shares does. I mean, this is the functional equivalent of you and I playing blackjack and me having a stalking horse who's doing side bets based upon whether I throw, the low card out or whatever it is. And so that's what I start to do.
Or looking at my cards.
Right.
And signaling to you. I mean, that's basically, it's rigged. And of course, the executives know when, actually, it's even worse than that, because the executives know when these open market repurchases are being done, but we don't know. So there's all kinds of insider trading around this issue, which was made easier by changes in the SEC rules that allowed executives to cash in their options as soon as they exercise them, which they couldn't do before 1991. There's a whole host of things that were structured to turn the people who are supposed to be managing companies on which we rely for massive amounts of employment, really the core of employment in the U.S. economy, turning them to what we call predatory value extractors, basically. And it's done under an ideology that says that, oh, no, this is all creating value. But once you recognize that the value is created by the, let's say, a company like Boeing, those engineers who go to work and create the planes of the future, and hopefully they're safe planes, or by government subsidies. I mean, Boeing as a company goes back to 1916 and wouldn't exist but for government subsidies and connection to the military and various. There was an article in the New York Times that was quite good about the Export-Import Bank being called Boeing's Bank. Right. Government subsidies. You could go on and on historically about this, but shareholders are just buying and selling shares. If you or I have some money we want to risk, we can just buy the shares and sell the shares.
Right. I mean, I no more than when I bet on the Red Sox to beat the Yankees, that I have helped the Red Sox win at that point. Now, all right. So, correct. Okay. So with that said, we have just a minute left in this segment. Just set up the dynamic. Now that we know that the CEOs have a vested interest in their stock price, how does this relate to Boeing?
Yeah, so Boeing, first of all, became what we call financialized around 1997 when it merged with McDonnell Douglas, and which actually was doing mainly military contracting, and those people became the top executives, and then they were really just wanted to grab all the money. Anyway, that was before anybody was thinking about the 737 MAX. But of course, the only responsibility or fundamental responsibility, as we argue in the article, of these executives to produce a safe plane. If they can't produce a safe plane, then they shouldn't be there, and that's fundamental. And there are only two companies in the world that right now can produce the kind of planes that Boeing is producing, and that's Airbus and Boeing. And so if they produce a safe plane, then they're going to get revenues. They're going to sell those planes. And it was clear in about the mid-2000, around 2004, 2005, that there was a new plane that was needed, a narrow-body mid-range plane, what they call the workhorse of the industry, which had been the 737 series that
All right,
needed
Bill,
to be upgraded.
Bill, let me stop you there. So we have this need
Okay.
for new plane. Let's take a break. When we come back, let's talk about how the way that the Boeing executives are incentivized created a plane that was not as safe as it should have been. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. We'll be right back on Ring of Fire Radio.